The year is 1415. Across a cold, rain-soaked field in northern France, 6,000 starving English soldiers stand face to face with 25,000 French knights, the finest cavalry Europe has ever seen. Within 3 hours, one army will vanish from the face of the earth. But it won't be the one you expect. This is the story of Agincourt, the most impossible military victory in history. To understand how England achieved the unthinkable, we must begin with the man who led them, King Henry V. Once known as Prince Hal, he was wild, reckless, and feared more for his drunken fights than his leadership. He brawled in taverns, insulted nobles, and even struck a judge in open court. His own father worried that when the crown passed to this unruly son, England would fall into ruin. But when Henry ascended the throne in 1413, something extraordinary happened. The wild prince vanished, and in his place rose a king forged of iron. He dismissed his drinking companions, repaid every debt, and spent sleepless nights poring over maps of France. Henry was obsessed. He believed the English crown had a divine claim to the French throne, a cause that could unite his restless kingdom and secure eternal glory. But it was a gamble on the edge of madness. France had 17 million people to England's 4 million. Its armies were wealthier, better equipped, and led by nobles who had spent their entire lives mastering the art of war. By comparison, Henry's England seemed small, poor, and hopelessly outmatched. Yet in August 1415, the young king gathered 12,000 men and sailed for France. His target, Harfleur, a vital port that would serve as England's foothold on French soil. Victory should have come quickly. Instead, disease struck first. Dysentery, the medieval soldier's curse, ripped through the English camp like wildfire. Men collapsed in agony, dying faster than they could be buried. By the time Harfleur surrendered, 5,000 Englishmen were dead, and winter was closing in. What remained of Henry's army was starving, feverish, and half-mad from exhaustion. Even his nobles begged him to return home. But Henry refused. He would not crawl back across the Channel in defeat. Instead, he ordered what seemed like a march to certain death, a 160-mile trek across enemy territory, straight into the heart of France. The march to Calais began like a funeral procession. What was left of Henry's army, 6,000 sick, starving, and wounded men, trudged north through the mud and rain. They had no food, no shoes, and no hope. French cavalry shadowed them from the hills, picking off stragglers and mocking them from a distance. Every mile felt like an eternity. Men gnawed on roots and nuts to stay alive. Many collapsed from hunger or disease and were quietly left behind to die. Those who survived walked barefoot through mud so deep that every step tore open their feet. Blood marked their path across France. At night, they huddled together for warmth, too exhausted to stand guard. French scouts circled like wolves, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Henry's will was unbreakable. He walked among his men, speaking softly, reminding them that they were Englishmen, that the honor of their kingdom rested on their endurance. He didn't ask them to fight for glory, only to survive long enough to reach the coast. To the French, this retreat looked like divine justice, a doomed army limping toward its end. Word spread quickly through the castles and manors of France. The English king was trapped with a broken army, cut off from supplies, exhausted, and surrounded. So the French nobility gathered like lions preparing for the kill. Knights and lords from across the realm answered the call to arms. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, took command of a host 4 times larger than Henry's. With him rode dukes, counts, and barons, men whose families traced their bloodlines back to Charlemagne himself. Their armor shone like mirrors in the autumn sun. Their banners rippled proudly in the wind. Each knight brought with him the arrogance of centuries, the belief that mounted nobles were born to rule the battlefield. They didn't see soldiers waiting for them, they saw prey. Some French lords even signed contracts dividing the ransom money they expected to collect after capturing the English nobles, including Henry himself. They were already arguing over who would have the privilege of dragging the English king through the streets of Paris in chains. It wasn't a battle they were preparing for. It was a celebration. But Henry had one weapon the French still underestimated, a weapon that would soon change the face of war forever. The English longbow. The morning of October 25, 1415, the feast of St. Crispin, dawned grey and cold. A mist hung over the muddy fields near the village of Agincourt. Across that narrow stretch of churned earth, 25,000 French soldiers glittered in armor, banners fluttering in the wind. Opposite them, the 6,000 weary Englishmen stood silent, gaunt faces, torn clothes, mud-caked boots, but eyes burning with defiance. Henry walked the line before dawn. He spoke not as a king, but as a brother in arms. He told them they fought not for gold or glory, but for England, for each other, and for survival. His words echoed over the misty field. "He that sheds his blood with me this day shall be my brother." Then, the storm began. English longbowmen, their fingers raw from the cold, raised their bows. When Henry gave the signal, a deadly rain filled the sky. Thousands of cloth-yard arrows hissed through the air in perfect rhythm. The sound was like tearing silk, then came the thuds. Armor split. Horses screamed. Men fell. At 300 yards, the longbow could pierce chain mail. At 200, it punched through plate. At 100 yards, it tore through flesh, armor, and horse alike. The front lines of French cavalry buckled instantly, crashing into the mud as their mounts collapsed beneath them. But the French kept coming. Wave after wave of knights charged forward, only to collide with the growing heap of men and horses that now clogged the narrow field. The ground turned to liquid filth, a pit of blood, bodies, and broken steel. The very weight of their armor became their doom. Men suffocated, trampled, drowned in mud. Those still standing were easy targets for the endless English arrows raining down. The battlefield turned into a vision of hell. Screams, the thunder of hooves, the whistle of arrows, it all merged into one endless roar. But for the English, discipline held. When the French survivors finally reached their lines, they met English men-at-arms on foot, wielding war hammers and poleaxes designed to shatter armor. The French knights, trained to fight only on horseback, were helpless once dismounted. Their heavy armor made them slow, clumsy, and blind. English soldiers danced around them, striking the joints and weak points with brutal precision. The might of French nobility was being dismantled by craftsmen, farmers, and yeomen, men who refused to kneel. In the heart of the chaos, King Henry himself fought on foot, his crown dented by a French war hammer, his sword stained with mud and blood. He stood shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers, rallying them every time the line faltered. He was no longer just a king, he was one of them. Then came the breaking point. The third French line, watching the slaughter from a distance, suddenly broke and fled. The greatest army in Europe, thousands of its finest knights, turned and ran. Their pride, their arrogance, their certainty, all vanished in the mud of Agincourt. When the dust settled, silence fell, a silence heavier than death. When the noise of battle finally faded, only the wind moved across the field. What had once been a sea of shining armor was now a carpet of twisted corpses. The mud of Agincourt ran red. And the impossible had happened, the starving English army still stood. The numbers defied belief. Over 6,000 French lay dead, including the very flower of their nobility. The Constable of France, 3 dukes, 5 counts, and nearly 100 barons were gone, men whose families had ruled since Charlemagne. Entire bloodlines were wiped from the earth in a single morning. The Duke of Brabant, arriving late, charged in desperation and was cut down almost instantly. Another, the Duke of Alençon, was captured and executed on Henry's orders when fresh French forces appeared on the horizon. The battlefield glittered with armor worth fortunes, the wealth of a kingdom scattered across the mud. By contrast, English losses were almost nothing, fewer than 100 men, some say as few as 25. It was a victory so one-sided that even eyewitnesses struggled to believe what they had seen. The laws of war, of logic, of mathematics, all had been broken that day. But the consequences went far beyond numbers. Agincourt shattered the idea of knightly supremacy. For centuries, Europe believed the armored cavalryman was invincible, that noble birth and shining steel made a man superior in battle. In a single afternoon, the longbow proved them wrong. Commoners had destroyed nobles. Peasants had broken princes. And the world would never be the same again. Whispers spread through Europe. If the English yeoman could defeat France's greatest knights, what did that say about the divine right of nobles to rule? Agincourt didn't just end a battle, it cracked the very foundation of feudalism. Henry V returned to England a hero, his name spoken in awe. Songs were sung, poems written, and his legend would live for centuries. But fate is cruel. Only 7 years later, Henry died of dysentery, just 35 years old, leaving behind an infant son and an empire already beginning to crumble. England's conquests would fade, its glory dimmed by lesser men. But the legend of Agincourt endured, a timeless reminder that courage, discipline, and determination can triumph against impossible odds. Because on that muddy field in France, David truly defeated Goliath. And all it took was a king with iron will, an army with nothing left to lose, and a sky darkened by arrows. As the echoes of Agincourt faded into history, one truth remained. Bravery is not born from numbers, nor forged from wealth or rank. It is born in the hearts of those who refuse to yield. Henry versus victory was not just a triumph of arms. It was a triumph of will, of faith, and of destiny. From that muddy field rose a legend. A reminder that even when the world stands against you, one determined soul can change the course of history. Military medal, this was not merely a battle. It was a miracle of men who believed they could not lose. As the music swells and the screen fades, the words appear. Agincourt, the day courage conquered kings. Then fade out to black with. Scroll, history remembers not the numbers, but the hearts that dared to stand.